Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history doesn't just tell stories, it keeps secrets. Tonight, we dim the lights and slip beneath the glittering facade of Hollywood, past the neon haze of Vegas, and deep into the silent corridors of the CIA, to meet a man who lived everywhere, yet was officially nowhere. His name was Johnny Roselli, but in the underworld, they called him Handsome Johnny, the mobster with movie star charisma, a government clearance, and a mission that reached all the way to the shores of Cuba and the Oval Office. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the mob's diplomat, Hollywood's silent partner, and the CIA's most dangerous mistake. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now in your part of the underworld? We love watching this secret society grow across borders, continents, and time zones, just like Roselli's influence once did. And hey, before we disappear into history's shadows, hit subscribe so you never miss the stories that were never meant to be told. Now settle in, breathe deep, hear the cards shuffle, the phone taps click, the papers marked top secret slide across the table. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The Making of Handsome Johnny. He was not supposed to be remembered. That was the nature of his kind. Men like him did not leave monuments, or memoirs, or public graves. They lived between shadows and whispers, wearing elegant suits and carrying secrets like untouchable currency. But imagine, for a moment, a cold July morning on a quiet pier in Florida decades later, when fishermen find a sealed metal drum floating near the mangroves. Inside, they discover pieces of a man. No fingerprints, no wallet, no name, just silence. And yet, somewhere in that silence was the echo of Hollywood's brightest lights, the hum of Las Vegas cash machines, and the deepest vaults of American intelligence. It was the final resting place of a man, once called Handsome Johnny. Long before he became that man, before movie stars toasted him and CIA officers whispered his name in dark corner booths, he was a small boy, stepping off a crowded steamship into a winter Boston harbor. The year was 1911. His name was Filippo Sacco, 6 years old, wearing a frayed coat too big for his arms and clutching his mother's thin hand like a promise. They had sailed from a place called Espionage, Italy, though Filippo had never known anything other than hunger, quiet villages, and the sound of his father arguing with fate. America was supposed to be something different. America was supposed to be loud. Boston was not loud. It was cold, unforgiving, and crowded with immigrants lost in its maze of gray brick buildings and wind that cut through worn shoes. Sacco's family stuffed into a dark tenement room, where broken windows rattled and neighbors argued in a dozen languages. Filippo's father died not long after, disappearing from the world without ceremony. His mother sewed buttons for pennies and stared out the window at night, not crying, just thinking. Filippo watched her, and something inside him hardened, not cruel, but determined. He did not want to disappear like his father. He wanted the world to know he existed. By the time he turned 12, Boston's immigration agents had changed his name. Filippo Sacco vanished into paper, and Johnny Roselli began to walk streets. He sold newspapers, shined shoes, and learned quickly that people did not ignore children who looked them in the eye. People talked to him. Some trusted him. He learned to listen, to smile without revealing anything, and to wear clothes as if they were armor. He noticed something else too. In evenings, when dock workers and rail bosses met in smoke-filled taverns, there were certain men others stood aside for. Men with polished shoes, heavy coats, and voices that did not need a shout. They had no titles, but they had power. In his silent heart, Johnny made a decision. He would not be lost in crowd. Chicago made that possible. At 15, mother gone, pockets empty, he boarded a train and left Boston behind. City greeted him like a furnace. Smoke, noise, endless pulse of people and industry. Chicago was alive, dangerous, and unashamed. Here, streets did not whisper. They dealt in violence, opportunity, and unspoken agreements. He slept in alleys at first, ate what he could, and watched. Always watching. He saw a young man shot in broad daylight, and nobody screamed. He saw big men carrying briefcases instead of guns, but people fear them more. He understood something important. Power did not look like force. It looked like control. Johnny began shining shoes again, this time outside Best Hotel in Chicago, where important men met and pretended not to notice boy polishing their leather. But Johnny noticed them. He learned names, habits, moods. He greeted them with a nod, never too friendly, never too eager. He remembered everything. Who owed money, who whispered about strikes, who feared who. It was here that a man with cold eyes and perfect cuffs paused longer than usual. He studied Johnny, then dropped more money than shine cost. He said nothing, just stared as if recognizing something rare. Weeks later, one of his men approached Johnny with a simple offer: deliver a package. No questions, no names. He delivered that package. Then another, then a dozen more. He never asked what was inside. He never insisted on knowing names. But he delivered them precisely, dressed neatly, never late, and always quiet. He did not look like a street boy anymore. He looked like someone to be noticed. And when he walked into certain establishments, men stopped talking, not because they feared him, but because they were curious. One bartender whispered, "That one's going places. He doesn't shout, he doesn't rush, but he's always moving forward." By 17, packages became conversations. Older men began to invite him to sit, not stand. They asked his opinion. He often said very little, but he made each word count. He knew he was no longer just a delivery boy. He had entered what people called the outfit, though no one ever used word out loud. These were men who did not rule by gunfire alone. They ruled by knowing things. Johnny listened to stories. He learned that real money did not come from petty rackets, but from controlling unions, trucking routes, movie theaters, and soon, casinos. He learned that violence was not weapon. Violence was punctuation. One evening, in a back room filled with cigar smoke and expensive suits, he heard laughter, a booming laugh, deep and confident. Everyone stood when man entered. He did not wear a crown, but his presence carried weight. Young men held their breath when he passed. Johnny looked up and saw a face he had only heard rumors about. A man who both terrified and fascinated Chicago. They called him Al. He had more power than most governors, more money than most bankers, and more enemies than he could count. But he walked as if nothing in the world could touch him. Someone whispered to Johnny, "Don't stare." Johnny did not stare, but he also did not look away too quickly. And in that brief moment, Al Capone glanced at him. A small look, barely noticeable. But for Johnny, it felt like a silent invitation. Not approval, not acceptance, but recognition. The kind of recognition that could change a boy's life forever. Chicago began to change him. He learned to wear suits tailored perfectly, shoes polished so sharply they reflected world back at people. He was not handsome in classic sense, but he had presence, a coolness, a silence people mistook for confidence or danger. Women noticed him. Men asked his advice. He carried himself not as someone trying to be important, but as someone who already was. That's when they stopped calling him Johnny. They started calling him Handsome Johnny. And names stuck. With that name came a certain power, not officially, but in way doors opened when he approached. He could walk into hotel lobbies without being questioned, sit in best nightclubs without paying. He was still young, but he understood something crucial. Perception was its own kind of currency. If people believed you were important, you already were. But importance came with eyes watching him. Some friendly, some calculating. Men began to ask him favors, to test loyalty. He never spoke too much. He never bragged. He never threatened. That made him both intriguing and dangerous. Quiet men in loud rooms often were. He knew he was being watched. He also knew he could not stay a messenger forever. Somewhere between polished shoes and soft-spoken deals, he began to dream bigger. Not of money, not even of power, but something stranger. He wanted to be in rooms where decisions were made. Not ones where orders were given, but ones where orders were written. He would remember those early years not for what he had, but for what he wanted. He wanted to never again feel like a ghost in someone else's world. He wanted to matter, not just in streets, but in places where law could not reach. Powerful men he met spoke about a future, not bound by cities or states, but by connections that stretched all the way from Chicago's smoke rooms to palm-lined streets of Los Angeles. A future where money flowed without trace, where names vanished from records, and where governments could need men like him. One evening, he was sent to deliver not a package, but a message. It was a test, though no one told him that. He entered a quiet club where lights were dim, conversations lower, and men inside sharper than razors. He spoke one sentence, passed on from someone higher. The recipient nodded, as if exact words mattered less than way he delivered them. Calm, certain, unflinching. When Johnny returned, nothing was said, but something had changed. He was no longer running errands. He was now being trusted with something invisible and far more valuable: influence. He walked home through snow that night, coat collar turned against wind, and for the first time he felt it. Not safety, not satisfaction, but momentum. Quiet thrill of moving into spaces where most men were not allowed to imagine. Tomorrow, someone would ask him to travel west, to Hollywood, and one day, much further, to Washington. But tonight, he walked alone, unaware that history was already waiting for him, far beyond city that had made him. Chapter 2, Hollywood Dream, Mob Reality. They told him the air smelled different in California. Not like Chicago, thick with soot and steel, but warm and sweet, like something had been baked in sunlight. When he stepped off the train at Los Angeles Union Station in the late 1920s, Johnny Roselli felt it immediately. The air didn't just feel different, it sounded different. Nothing echoing, no walls crowding in, just wide streets and wide dreams. Out here, power had no smoke or blood on it. It had smiles, champagne, and spotlights. Power dressed in tuxedos and read movie scripts. He adjusted his suit jacket, even though no one seemed to care how silk laid over shoulders in this town. Here, no one paused for a man in a fine suit. That intrigued him. In Chicago, respect was worn like armor. In Hollywood, it was disguised. It shimmered on screens, whispered through studio gates, and lived in the eyes of men who never touched a gun but moved millions with a signature. He realized quickly, this place was dangerous in a different way. Nobody shot to kill. They wrote you out of the story. It didn't take long for him to understand the real business beneath Hollywood's glamour. At night, he wandered through bars that pretended to be exclusive. Everyone wanted to be seen. Agents, actors, cigar-smoking studio executives, and men pretending to be all three. At one of those bars, Musso and Frank's, he met a whisper. A man heavy with perfume and secrets told him something in a low voice. In this town, movies make millions, but nobody really knows where all the money goes. Studios hid finances better than any criminal ever could. Profit schemes, union scams, backroom deals, all of it wrapped in silk and California sun. Johnny listened, watched, and remembered. He sat quietly at tables where deals were made between men who thought they were playing each other, unaware that a third player had just quietly sat down. He didn't interrupt, didn't brag, didn't press. He simply waited, and Hollywood, like Chicago before it, began to turn its head and notice him. One night, inside the grand lobby of the Ambassador Hotel, he noticed a producer arguing with a union representative. The union man wanted higher wages for film crew workers. The producer wanted those wages kept low. Johnny watched. No blows thrown, no threats made, just nods, handshakes, cigars, and the occasional fake smile. Except the tension felt exactly like Chicago. Pressure without violence. Influence without fingerprints. That's when he realized something fascinating. Hollywood didn't need the mob's muscle. It needed its structure, its ability to control without leaving trace. Soon, someone approached him. No big introduction, no flashy suit. Just a handshake from a well-connected studio accountant. They needed a man like him, they said. Someone who understood organization. Someone who knew how to keep things quiet, orderly, and profitable. Someone who knew how to make problems disappear without bodies disappearing with them. Hollywood had enough scandals, affairs, and addictions to last a century. What it didn't have was discipline. Johnny offered exactly that. In Chicago, control came from fear. In Hollywood, it came from access. And suddenly, Johnny had access to everybody. Studio heads, union bosses, talent managers, chorus girls, actors who drank too much, directors who owed too much. Everywhere he went, doors opened, drinks were poured, and voices lowered when he entered a room. The Chicago outfit hadn't just planted a representative. They had planted a diplomat. He became the quiet middleman in 1,000 unspoken negotiations. Someone's mistress needed to be flown out of town. Someone's drug problem needed discreet handling. A famous actor needed protection from a scandal that might ruin him. Studio head didn't want the union to picket outside the lot. Johnny didn't threaten. He arranged. He learned quickly that the studios were terrified of disruption. They could rewrite a script, reshoot a scene, even recast stars. But they couldn't afford delayed production. Every day a movie didn't film was a day hundreds of thousands of dollars vanished. Unions knew that. Mob knew that. Johnny knew it best. He began working quietly with union leaders. They respected him, feared him, but most importantly, they listened to him. He made sure there were no violent strikes, no disruptive protests. In return, he made sure workers got just enough to feel valued, but not enough to challenge the system. He wasn't playing both sides. He was holding both sides. He didn't just manage unions. He began shaping them. He influenced who sat at negotiation tables, who made decisions, and more importantly, who didn't. Soon, certain people began to disappear from Hollywood. Not physically, but professionally. Careers ended not with gunshots, but with unanswered phone calls. Then came the Screen Extras Guild, the smallest union, least respected, barely noticed. But Johnny saw what no one else did. Extras were everywhere. Thousands of them. On every set, in every crowd scene. Silent in films, but listening in real life. They saw and heard everything. Conversations, affairs, secret deals, off-the-record arguments. In a town where secrets meant money, Johnny understood that extras might just become the most valuable people in Hollywood. With quiet funding from Chicago, Johnny helped strengthen the union. Better pay, better treatment, better organization. He didn't do it because he cared about extras. He did it because he cared about leverage. And soon, the man who controlled the extras controlled Hollywood's silence. If Johnny wanted a rumor to disappear, it disappeared. If he wanted one to spread, it spread faster than a magazine headline. By early 1930s, Johnny wasn't just in Hollywood. He was part of it. But unlike the others, he didn't want his name on posters. He wanted it on contracts no one could trace. He didn't want fame. He wanted invisibility. He started hosting quiet dinners at the Brown Derby, where studio heads sat beside union enforcers, where actors exchanged jokes with mob accountants, and nobody thought it was strange. That was Johnny's gift, making the unnatural look perfectly natural. He wore his signature suits, not flashy, but perfect. He had the hair of a matinee idol, but the eyes of a man always calculating the next move. People called him Handsome Johnny not just for how he looked, but for how he never broke a sweat in rooms that could suffocate men twice his size. One night, a studio executive asked him, almost jokingly, "Are you in movies, Johnny?" He smiled, held his drink, and said, "No, but movies are in me." People laughed. Nobody forgot the line. But it wasn't just Hollywood watching him now. Chicago was watching too. Back home, gangsters spoke of the young man who could sit between stars and mob bosses and never be asked to leave the table. The outfit sent men to observe him. They didn't come to protect him. They came to learn from him. Hollywood wasn't just glamorous. It was profitable. Real money. Money you couldn't track. Money cleaned through studios, theaters, ticket sales. And soon, Chicago wanted in deeper. New plans were forming. Plans involving Nevada. Plans involving desert casinos and hotel palaces, and whispers that made more money than bootleg whiskey ever could. Vegas was beginning to rise from sand. They asked him if he wanted to help. Not as muscle, not as hitman, but as architect. They didn't want him to run casinos. They wanted him to build the bridge between Hollywood's money, Chicago's enforcement, and Vegas's dream. He would introduce investors from film studios. He would invite actors to gamble, to perform, to make headlines. He would sell glamour to a desert. He didn't answer immediately. He had grown to like Los Angeles. The sunshine, the gentle power, the way threats could hide behind handshakes and smiles. But Johnny was not sentimental. He knew where history was moving. He saw it clearly, a triangle. Chicago, Hollywood, Las Vegas, all connected by money, all connected by silence, all connected by him. One night, he attended a small party thrown by a studio head. The guest list was unusual. There were actors, producers, and 3 very powerful men pretending not to know one another. Johnny knew all their real names, and none of them had ever been on a movie screen. One of them leaned toward him and said, softly, "You're not just part of this. You're shaping it." It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. Hollywood had given him reputation. Las Vegas would give him empire. But empire came with enemies. Late one evening, walking alone down Sunset Boulevard, he paused. The neon signs flickered like artificial stars. Music spilled from clubs. Laughter bounced off expensive cars. And yet, something felt different. Something felt temporary. He straightened his cufflinks and understood the moment. Los Angeles had given him its secrets. Now it was time for Las Vegas to give him its future. Chicago would send for him soon. Mighty men would want to hear his ideas about casinos, unions, film financing, and how to skim a fortune without leaving a fingerprint. One man, in particular, had already taken notice. A living legend. A man who trusted almost no one, but had begun asking about the calm young man from Hollywood who never raised his voice. He wanted to meet him. His name was Meyer Lansky, and that meeting would change everything. Chapter 3. Enter Las Vegas, the Golden Skim Era. Las Vegas didn't look like a future empire when Johnny first saw it. It looked like a sunburned mistake sitting in the middle of the Nevada desert. A gas station, a few dusty gambling halls, a diner where tired travelers scraped dust from their teeth. But Chicago didn't see sand. Chicago saw potential. They saw a place far from New York judges, far from Chicago reporters, far from Washington eyes. A place where money could breathe before it disappeared. Johnny stepped onto Fremont Street in 1941, adjusted his suit, and didn't see casinos. He saw canvas. He saw something that did not exist yet, but was waiting to be built. The first real glimpse of that vision came not in desert wind, but inside a hotel room where heavy curtains were closed tight in the middle of the afternoon. 3 men sat at a round table. 2 were silent. One spoke like he already owned half the country. Meyer Lansky wasn't loud or imposing. He didn't smoke cigars or wear flashy diamonds. His suit was quiet. His voice was soft. But when he looked at Johnny, Johnny understood why people called him the mob's accountant. This was a man who didn't need to swing a hammer. He built foundations. He didn't waste time. He spoke of casinos, not as dens of vice, but as institutions. Places where millions could pass through day after day, and nobody could keep track of how much actually existed. Places where money became air, invisible and untaxable. All he needed was order, discretion, and someone who understood that influence wasn't just taking money. It was deciding who got to sit at which table. Johnny listened. He didn't interrupt. That was why Lansky liked him. Most men spoke too soon. Johnny waited until silence was finished speaking. Then he asked one question. Hollywood will want in. Will they be welcome? Lansky didn't smile, but something in his eyes lit like a match being struck in a cathedral. Hollywood wasn't just welcome. Hollywood would be the bait. The plan was elegant. Las Vegas wouldn't be sold as gambling. It would be sold as fantasy. Chicago would build the casino floors. New York would finance the hotels. Hollywood would supply the glamour. And Johnny Roselli would tie their hands together, so tightly that none of them could ever truly separate again. His role was not to run a casino. His role was to run the narrative. Bugsy Siegel had already made headlines with his Flamingo Hotel. Johnny wasn't reckless like Bugsy, but he understood the performance of it all. Vegas had to look beautiful, even if its books were drowning in blood and debt. People wouldn't care where the money came from as long as it was being spent on bright lights, satin curtains, and a stage where Frank Sinatra could sing on Saturday nights. Johnny knew how to get Sinatra. He also knew how to get the people who controlled Sinatra. When construction began on the Desert Inn and later the Sands, Johnny didn't oversee concrete mixing or carpet installation. He oversaw the illusion. His job was to convince the world that mob-run hotels were respectable places to bring your wife and wear your tuxedo. That these palaces rising from the sand were not built by the outfit, but by visionaries. He invited actors, producers, union bosses, film financiers. He reserved private rooms for them. Let them gamble. Let them drink. Let them make deals with each other. But more importantly, let them be seen. Las Vegas wouldn't become powerful because gangsters ran it. Las Vegas would become powerful because celebrities blessed it. Nobody understood this more than Johnny. After all, he had built his usefulness on one principle. The mob didn't just need control. It needed credibility. The skim was already happening, even before the carpets were fully laid down. The idea was simple, but genius. The counting rooms recorded official revenue. But the real counting happened before the money ever got there. A little removed here, a little removed there. Not too much, just enough to make millions disappear without getting noticed. Johnny always said it was like shaving ice. Done right, no one sees what's been taken. He didn't handle the skim directly. Men like Mo Dalitz, Frank Costello, and Lansky's trusted enforcers did that. But it was Johnny who ensured the people who asked questions stopped asking. A state official suddenly found himself nominated for a social club membership. A reporter who had been curious about the Sands payroll found himself sitting with Dean Martin in a private lounge. "So tell me," Dean would say, smiling, "you really want to write about ledgers?" Johnny once said there were only 3 ways to protect a secret in Las Vegas. You could buy it, bury it, or better, distract it with a showgirl and a martini. Soon, word spread in Los Angeles. Vegas wasn't just a desert getaway. It was a place where millionaires and gangsters played cards at the same tables, and nobody asked who was who. Johnny made sure that same mystery attracted the only people who mattered, those who thrived on attention, and those who thrived on avoiding it. Hollywood money quietly began funding casino expansion. But it wasn't just investors. Some were partners. Some were owners. Some were just faces that made casinos look legitimate on magazine covers. Frank Sinatra didn't own the Sands, but he made America believe he did. That illusion alone was worth more than 10 gunmen. Johnny never liked the spotlight, but in Las Vegas, his absence became a kind of myth. People whispered about the man who showed up to meetings without showing up in photographs. The man who never stood on stage but designed the seating. The man who didn't gamble, but always left a winner. One night, in a private dining room of the Sands, surrounded by movie stars, boxing promoters, and governors pretending not to know who was paying for their drinks, someone joked that Johnny was the ambassador of Vegas. Nobody laughed. It didn't sound like a joke. He moved between worlds so smoothly that even the FBI struggled to place him. Not officially tied to casinos. Not officially tied to film studios. Not officially tied to the Chicago outfit. He existed between the lines, and federal agents don't read between the lines. They read files. Files didn't have his name. They had rumors. But rumors traveled further than files. He met Sam Giancana briefly during this period, though back then, Sam wasn't the leader of the Chicago outfit. He was ambitious, unpredictable, charming, and violent. They respected each other, but they were very different men. Giancana believed in force. Johnny believed in permission. Giancana made people listen by raising his voice. Johnny made them listen by lowering his. Las Vegas changed quickly. By the early 1950s, casinos weren't just buildings. They were systems. Every slot machine turned into a vein, pumping money through hidden networks. Every blackjack table became a miniature negotiation. Every headliner performance became an alibi for something else happening backstage. Johnny had a new goal now. He didn't just want Las Vegas to grow. He wanted it untouchable. He started lobbying quietly for political protection, getting senators free rooms, getting judges invited to Hollywood premieres. Soon, men who wrote laws were drinking cocktails mixed by bartenders on mob payrolls. Legal protection rarely looked like legal protection. It looked like a weekend getaway someone would rather not admit to. Some nights, he would stand alone outside the Sands Casino, cigarette lit, suit pressed, eyes calm. The neon lights would blink like artificial stars, and laughter would roll across the parking lot like distant waves. He would watch the crowds, rich and poor, entertainers and politicians, mobsters and missionaries, all walking into a place they believed was built for them. They never understood the truth. It wasn't built for them. It was built because of them. Because Las Vegas was never designed to entertain America. It was designed to feed it. The money that disappeared didn't just vanish. It traveled. To Cuba. To Hollywood. To Switzerland. To Chicago. To politicians who stood at podiums denouncing gambling, while privately praying to never see what their bank accounts looked like without it. Johnny heard whispers now, not just about casinos, but about Washington. The scam money had gotten too big, too untraceable, too attractive to men whose power didn't come from pistols, but pens. And one night, Lansky pulled him aside and said something that didn't sound like a request, but an invitation. "There is a bigger game than this," he said softly. "A game we do not yet control. Cuba is just the beginning. There are governments that need men like us now. Men like you." Johnny didn't answer right away. He never did. But he knew something was changing. Las Vegas was no longer the frontier. It was the bank. And soon, the bankers would knock. The first knock would not come from Hollywood, not from Chicago, not even from Cuba. It would come from Washington. It would come wearing a suit. And it would come with a top-secret clearance and an offer that would change everything. Chapter 4. The Hollywood Union Boss Wars. The first time he understood that Hollywood feared silence more than guns was not inside a casino or a studio office, but in a dimly lit back room of a Beverly Hills restaurant, where cigar smoke pooled like ghostly fog near the ceiling and laughter sounded too rehearsed. Johnny sat quietly, as always, not interrupting, not drawing attention, yet everyone in the room knew exactly where he was. A group of powerful movie producers were arguing with two union men over money, contracts, and who truly ran Hollywood. The producers spoke with indignation, like they were kings defending a castle. The union men spoke with calculation, like they already had the drawbridge in their pocket. But Johnny noticed something the others didn't. Neither side was in control. The real power now belonged to whoever could stop the fight without being seen. That was his signal. He stood, straightened his jacket without a word, walked to the table, and placed his hand gently on its center. The room fell silent, not because of who he was, but because he had never before spoken in that room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He simply told them, calmly, that Hollywood was not at war with unions, nor were the unions at war with Hollywood. No, he said, both sides were in business together. They just didn't know it yet. They listened. Even the men who didn't like him had to admit they respected his stillness. That was the night Johnny Roselli stopped being a liaison. He had become something much more dangerous. He became necessary. The Chicago outfit had sent him to protect their interests in Hollywood. But Hollywood didn't need protection in the way Chicago understood protection. It needed organization. It needed someone who could turn chaos into order, arguments into agreements, and greed into structured profit. Johnny knew the future of organized crime wasn't gambling or extortion. It was management. Hollywood had more money flowing through it than any bootlegging ring or gambling racket. It was a river, wide and glittering, but uncontrolled. Movie budgets were numbers on paper, but nobody really knew where the money went after it left the studio vaults. Union strikes could shut down productions for weeks, costing millions, ruining schedules. Actors, directors, and crew members were powerful, but they didn't understand how power worked. They still believed it came from applause. Johnny didn't. He knew it came from permission. He understood something crucial. Hollywood's greatest product wasn't movies. It was illusion, and that illusion needed to be protected at any cost. The public didn't want to know that the leading man was a broken addict, or that the studio boss was paying extortion to keep his mistress quiet, or that the money funding the next major motion picture had been skimmed from card tables in Las Vegas. They wanted dreams. And Johnny made sure nothing interfered with those dreams, not even reality. He didn't intimidate with threats. He intimidated with solutions. Film unions began seeing him not as an intruder, but as a mediator. He could end disputes faster than lawyers, and more peacefully than the enforcer Chicago would normally send. He understood leverage, but he also understood something more valuable: timing. A strike threatened to shut down Paramount. He'd make a phone call. A scandal threatened to doom an actor's rising career. He quietly flew that actor to Palm Springs until magazines found a newer scandal to chase. A studio boss needed to avoid union headaches during a major production. Johnny would walk into the negotiation room, sit between the union rep and the studio lawyer, and say nothing, until the moment both sides looked at him for direction. That moment always came sooner than expected. Soon, he was not policing Hollywood. He was shaping it. He began quietly deciding which union leaders stayed in power and which mysteriously lost their positions. He introduced new faces, men who understood that negotiation didn't need yelling, only presence. Some of those men were loyal to him. Some didn't even know they were. The trick wasn't to install puppets. The trick was to align incentives. If everyone made money, everyone cooperated. If everyone cooperated, Johnny remained invisible. But not everyone liked this invisible power. There were men in Hollywood who believed they controlled the studios. Men who believed that Johnny's influence was a threat. They tried to push him out. Some hired private investigators. Some whispered to federal agents. Some even tried to summon actual mobsters to root him out, thinking they were saving Hollywood from some small-time wise guy. What they didn't know was that Johnny wasn't a small-time anything anymore. One studio lawyer made the mistake of describing him as a gangster in front of a U.S. senator. Days later, that lawyer lost his influence overnight. Not because he was attacked, not because he was threatened, but because nobody returned his calls. In Hollywood, that was worse than a threat. That was erasure. Johnny didn't need to be feared. He just needed to be required. He began helping studios secure illegal financing without making it look illegal. He turned gambling losses from Vegas into movie budgets. He turned losses on paper into profits for accountants. He made sure films were funded, celebrities were protected, and unions stayed quiet. Producers who once thought the mob was a nuisance now invited Johnny to private dinners. Some nights, after hours of negotiation, Johnny would sit at the edge of a bar in the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, watching actors drunk on fame, producers drunk on power, and singers drunk on whiskey. He would sip his drink slowly, thinking about how strange it was. Gangsters spent years trying to gain influence, but Hollywood was giving it away for free, wrapped in velvet and lit by neon lights. He once told a Chicago associate, "In New York, they buy power. In Chicago, they take it. But in Hollywood, Hollywood gives it away to whoever knows how to hold it." The outfit began to realize they had underestimated him. He was not just a man managing their interests. He was positioning himself at the center of something much bigger. The unspoken alliance between entertainment, organized labor, and criminal finance. A triangle of influence where deals were made not in alleyways, but in golf clubs and award ceremonies. He introduced Chicago to Hollywood producers. He introduced Las Vegas to movie investors. He introduced senators to Vegas casino owners. And like a conductor, he never made a sound, yet everything moved at his signal. He once sat in a private lounge at the Sands Hotel with a Hollywood director, a Las Vegas casino executive, a Chicago enforcer, and a Washington insider. They all spoke in carefully guarded language. They didn't want to reveal too much. Yet every one of them kept glancing at Johnny, not for approval, but for confirmation. It was in that moment he realized something astonishing. He wasn't just in the room. He had built a room. But rooms like that don't stay quiet forever. People began asking questions. Reporters noticed patterns. Politicians grew suspicious of how smoothly Hollywood unions suddenly cooperated. FBI agents started developing interest in a man with no official job, no studio position, no union office, no casino license, yet appeared on guest lists of every significant meeting. They didn't know what he did. They only knew he was always there. One night, as he sat alone outside the sands, smoke drifting like a tired ghost from his cigarette. He watched headlines breaking from Havana. Cuba was rising. Casinos, nightclubs, tourism, mob money, real money. Money that didn't need Hollywood fantasy or Las Vegas illusion. Money that was already approved by governments. And yet, something felt strange. Las Vegas was secure. Hollywood was protected. Unions were controlled. But Washington was now curious. The men in Washington didn't ask for union settlements. They asked for secrets. They asked for strategy. They asked for access, not to casinos, but to Castro. Johnny wasn't a hitman. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even a boss. He was something scarier. He was a translator. He could translate the language of money to the language of power. Someone in Washington knew that. One afternoon, an invitation arrived. No signature, no seal, just a place, a time, and a flight number. Washington wanted to talk. They didn't want a gangster. They wanted a consultant, a man who could understand how influence travels. Johnny folded the invitation, placed it into his inside pocket, and did something rare. He smiled, because this wasn't an invitation to a meeting. It was an invitation to history, and the history waiting for him was wearing a CIA badge. Chapter 5, Cold War Connections. The CIA comes knocking. He always believed that silence was his greatest weapon. But on a cloudless afternoon in Washington, Johnny Roselli discovered something even more powerful. A question. One that came from a man who didn't smile, didn't blink, and didn't wear his suit to impress anyone. The man didn't ask about Hollywood. He didn't ask about casinos or Las Vegas scam operations. He didn't even mention the mob. He simply leaned forward across a polished table in a room that smelled faintly of cold coffee and government secrets, and asked, "If this were your country, Mr. Roselli, how would you defend it?" Johnny didn't answer immediately. He never did. But in that moment, he realized he was no longer talking to businessmen or producers, mob captains or union bosses. He was speaking to men who didn't pay with money, men who paid with history. They met in a discreet townhouse, not in a government building. No official nameplates, no portraits of presidents, no flags, just blinds drawn tightly and soft murmurs from the next room. Johnny had been invited, but not as a suspect, not as a target, not as a boastful Hollywood mob liaison. He had been invited as something rare, a problem solver. The two men in front of him didn't hide their identities. They didn't need to. One worked for a branch of government so concealed that even its name seemed classified. The other was an intermediary, a man from Las Vegas who looked more like an accountant than an operator. Johnny recognized neither of their faces, but he recognized the power in how little they needed to say. They didn't want casinos. They didn't want Hollywood. They wanted something more unconventional. They wanted access to the only resource the United States government couldn't officially use, deniable talent. Johnny didn't speak. He just listened. They didn't talk in dramatic terms. No mention of treason or spy thrillers. Just a quiet phrase repeated twice. Unconventional solutions. Followed later by, "This is not for men who need recognition." He understood instantly. This wasn't about business. This was about Castro. Fidel Castro had just taken Cuba, and the United States had no idea how to get rid of him. Cuba wasn't just a neighboring country. It was an open window into America's biggest vulnerabilities. It was a communist echo reaching across Florida's shoreline. It was a geopolitical insult wrapped in revolution. America's biggest generals could not touch him. America's finest diplomats could not break him. America's richest bankers could not buy him. So America did the only thing left. It turned to the types of men it refused to publicly acknowledge. Men like Johnny. The CIA wasn't naive. They knew Johnny wasn't an assassin. He wasn't the kind of man to poison a drink or plant explosives under a car. But he knew the men who could. He knew how to find them, speak to them, recruit them. Not with threats, but with respect. He could sit at a table with actors, mob captains, and senators, and somehow leave the table with all of them believing he was on their side. That's what made him dangerous. And that's what made him perfect. They explained the mission with polite detachment. No shouting. No maps of Cuba pinned to walls. Just clinical dialogue. Castro cannot be removed by conventional means. Johnny nodded. We need discreet management of certain resources. Johnny understood. We want someone who can talk to particular individuals who would rather not talk to us. Johnny said nothing. He didn't have to. The deal they proposed was unspoken. The CIA would provide discretion, money that didn't technically exist, immunity that couldn't be written, and doors that didn't officially open. In return, Johnny would provide what they lacked. Human assets. Skilled assets. Assets that never appeared on government payroll. It was not a job. It was a ghost assignment. Soon, meetings shifted from Washington to hotel rooms in Miami, where Cuban exiles, mob lieutenants, and government couriers shared tables under false names. In dimly lit lounges near Biscayne Bay, men spoke Spanish, Italian, English, and a new silent language, the language of covert collaboration. 3 names kept surfacing. Santo Trafficante, the mob's man in Havana. Sam Giancana, rising in Chicago with ambition sharp enough to cut steel. And Felix Rodriguez, a Cuban exile whose hatred for Castro made him valuable and dangerous. Johnny didn't recruit these men like a boss. He recruited them like a composer. One instrument at a time. Each played a different note. But only he knew the melody. They weren't hired. They were convinced. To Trafficante, he whispered, "You once owned Havana. Would you like to own it again?" To Giancana, he said, "This isn't about money. It's about being in the room where presidents listen." And to the men who made poisons, explosives, disguises, and silence, he said nothing. They already understood their purpose. It was never about a bullet, or a poison capsule, or a staged car accident. It was about denying Castro a future. The first plan was simple. Bribe a Cuban waiter in an exclusive Havana nightclub to slip Castro a toxin. The idea felt almost elegant, as if assassination could be done with silver trays and folded napkins. Money was delivered, pills manufactured, timing prepared. It failed, not dramatically, just quietly. The waiter never showed. Or maybe he did. But he pocketed the money and disappeared across the Caribbean. No arrests, no evidence, no results, only silence. The CIA was frustrated. They preferred geometry, plans with blueprints and timelines. Johnny preferred chess. He knew patience wasn't failure. It was positioning. The second plan was less elegant. Hire a hitman. Deliver a weapon. Stage a public execution under disguise of uprising. Too obvious. Too political. Too likely to expose. Plans came and went. Cigars full of toxins. Dive gear laced with chemicals. Fake lovers. Real lovers. Missing lovers. None worked. Castro was brilliant, suspicious, and almost theatrically lucky. Some began to joke that he didn't smoke cigars for pleasure, but for sport. He would light one, look at the camera, and wait to see who flinched. The CIA grew impatient. Giancana grew louder. But Johnny never changed tone. He knew something no one else did. The point wasn't to kill Castro. The point was to stay close enough that, one day, they might. Meanwhile, Las Vegas thrived. Hollywood kept glowing. The skim deepened. The union bosses remained loyal. And Johnny? Johnny began living a life divided between 3 worlds that officially did not recognize one another. Hollywood paid him in illusions. Vegas paid him in hidden money. The CIA paid him with silence. He didn't officially exist in any of them, but he was needed by all of them. One night in Miami, at the Fontainebleau Hotel, in a suite that overlooked the moonlit ocean, Johnny sat with Sam Giancana, a man whose ambition was now too large for Chicago. Sam wore confidence like it was body armor. He believed the CIA partnership would make him untouchable. He believed politicians would eventually need men like him. He believed that history could be bought like hotel real estate. Johnny watched him, listening. "You know what we're building, Johnny?" Giancana said, pouring whiskey. "We're building a country inside a country." Johnny quietly nodded. But in his mind, he thought something different. He thought, "No, Sam, you are building a stage. But you don't know who's writing the script." The script was not being written in Chicago. Not in Havana. Not in Hollywood. not even fully in Washington. It was being written in shadows. And Johnny was learning that shadows did not honor loyalty. They only honored usefulness. The CIA wasn't sentimental. They didn't protect friends. It protected outcomes. Johnny was useful because he could recruit men without writing their names. He could move money without leaving records. He could operate in worlds the government would never dare to officially acknowledge existed. But one day, they would ask him for something impossible. Something bigger than Castro. Something that wouldn't involve poison, bribes, or Cuban waiters. They would ask him to erase not just a man, but a president. That story would come soon. It would arrive in Dallas. It would arrive with echoing gunshots in November. But before that came another invitation. Different location, different stakes. This time, it wouldn't be a quiet townhouse in Washington. It would be an office, a labeled one, 6 letters, CIA, headquarters. And this time, they wouldn't just ask for help. They would ask him to lead the mission. Chapter 6, Operation Mongoose, the mob versus Castro. By the time the sun rose over Langley on that autumn morning, the decision had already been made. No congressional approval, no presidential signature, no official record. The CIA, frustrated, embarrassed by the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and terrified of a communist stronghold just 90 miles off Florida shore, had turned to a confession whispered behind closed doors. If the government couldn't kill Castro, maybe the mob could. Washington didn't care about morality anymore. They cared about plausible deniability. And the perfect man to stand between two worlds, wearing neither uniform nor fedora, was handsome Johnny Roselli. They flew him to a quiet estate in Maryland, far from the city lights, where the rooms echoed and no staff wore name tags. They didn't call it recruiting. They called it consultation. They didn't ask him to break laws. They asked him how laws could be avoided without leaving footprints. They sat across from him, men in pressed trousers and polished language, and they asked about his friends. Not the Hollywood actors, not the Vegas pit bosses. The other ones. The kind whose names were spoken quietly, whose movements never made newspapers, whose addresses existed only in memory. These were the men Washington needed, because these were the men Washington could never officially acknowledge. He listened. He did what he always did. He didn't respond too quickly. He took in every detail, every pause in their speech, every glance between suits. They wanted him to organize something that he had always been paid to prevent. Violence not for profit, but for policy. Not for territory. Not for revenge. For national security. They didn't hand him a document. They handed him an idea. A code name. Operation Mongoose. It felt strange, almost cinematic, to be part of something with a name. Men like Johnny lived in the margins, outside headlines and title pages. But now, history had given him a project. He wasn't being asked to skim money from casinos or negotiate a labor dispute. He was being asked to help plan an assassination sanctioned by fear and secrecy. To him, it didn't feel like treason. It felt like business. The same rules applied. No noise, no fingerprints, no bodies found unless necessary. He could almost hear his old mentors whispering, "A clean job isn't one that goes perfectly. It's one that never happened." He didn't go to Havana himself. He didn't hold a rifle or mix poison in a glass tumbler. That wasn't his purpose. Instead, he called 2 men. One in Chicago, one in Tampa. Sam Giancana. Sano Trafficani. He didn't call them because they were the loudest or the most violent. He called them because they understood something important. Not every bullet is fired from a gun. Some are whispered in bars. Some are hidden in pills. Some are delivered in envelopes with no return address. The first meetings didn't look like secret missions. They looked like lunches. Tables set near hotel pools where no one asked for last names. Where ice melted slowly in tall glasses. Where secrets punched through laughter like quiet thunder. Johnny played translator between worlds. The CIA spoke in codes, in cautious proposals, in language meant to shape history. The mob spoke in certainty, in efficiency, in language meant to erase men from it. Plans began. Some were clever. Some were insane. One involved hiring a magician to slip a poison pill into Castro's drink during a nightclub performance. Another involved coating a diving suit with a bacteria that would eat his skin. One called for exploding seashells, beautiful, deadly, floating innocently near where the Cuban leader liked to swim. They sounded like children's ideas whispered in a dark schoolyard. But no one was laughing. Johnny didn't offer ideas. He offered credibility. He introduced the poison man, the logistics man, the Cuban exile who would deliver the package with a smile. He knew every man who whispered and every man who listened. He also knew something the CIA hadn't learned yet. Castro was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of being humiliated. That's what made him impossible. Santo Trafficante, the mob's former king of Havana, walked through Miami like a ghost of a lost empire. He had ruled casinos in Cuba before Castro took them. He didn't want to kill a man. He wanted to reclaim a country. He would look across the water at night, toward the dark outline of Cuba, and whisper, "That was my Vegas before Vegas was a thing." He was motivated not just by revenge, but by memory. Giancana, on the other hand, wasn't thinking about Cuba or national security. He was thinking about Washington, about what it meant to be useful to men who had their own armies and satellites and secrets. He wanted to leave Chicago behind. He wanted to move from mobster to strategist, from criminal to partner. Johnny saw that hunger in his eyes, and he quietly feared it. Men who craved power were unpredictable. Men who craved legitimacy were dangerous. The CIA provided money, documents, safe houses. They provided maps of Havana, schedules, lists of concierges, waiters, and bar staff who could be bought. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered were the conversations. In Miami motel rooms, in hotel lobbies, in Cuban exile bars where walls were plastered with faded flags and desperate dreams. Men whispered of uprising, revolution, assassination. But Johnny noticed something in those rooms that the CIA didn't. The key to killing Castro wasn't in money, or tactics, or timing. It was trust, and trust was the one thing the government could never buy. Johnny understood trust. It was the same in Chicago, Hollywood, Vegas, and Miami. You didn't earn it by being honest. You earned it by being useful. And nobody was more useful in these circles than Handsome Johnny, because he never asked for credit, never asked for names, never asked for anything except discretion. He made people feel safe, even while planning something anything but safe. Months passed. Operations failed. Poison pills vanished. Money disappeared. Assassins backed out. Castro did more than survive. He became mythic. With every failed attempt, he seemed less like a leader and more like an idea. And ideas are harder to kill than men. The CIA grew desperate. Politicians grew curious. Rumors spread. Something was happening outside government oversight. Something was happening that no one could quite prove, but everyone could feel. Castro even joked about it publicly, holding up a cigar at a press conference, saying, "If they want to kill me, they will have to find a better way than this." Crowds laughed. Washington did not. Johnny kept moving between cities. Miami, Chicago, Vegas. He didn't lead the mission. He didn't own it. He didn't even know all of it. He simply held it together. Untouchable. Invisible. Yet essential. But something began to change. This was no longer just a project. This was becoming something darker. National security was turning into obsession. The CIA stopped asking if Castro could be killed. They began asking when. And then, something even more chilling, someone whispered, "If he can't be removed, he might have to be replaced." But not by someone elected. Johnny did not answer that conversation. He stood and left the room. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something the CIA did. You can hire criminals to kill a threat, but you can't hire them to rebuild a nation. He wasn't a revolutionary. He wasn't a patriot. He wasn't even a loyal soldier to the underworld. He was something far more elusive. He was a man who helped systems survive. But now, both systems, government and mob, were slowly starting to believe they didn't need him anymore. And that was the most dangerous moment in any operation. The moment when the middleman becomes the liability. In a room in Miami, on a night thick with humidity and doubt, Johnny lit a cigarette and said to himself, "This will not end clean." Every man in that operation had secrets, but Johnny knew the biggest one. The moment a secret grows too big for one side, it belongs to neither. It belongs to all. And one day, it starts talking back. Chapter 7, Bay of Pigs, Betrayal and Embarrassment. They said it would take only 3 days. That was the promise. American-backed Cuban exiles would land on a lonely beach, stir a quiet uprising, topple a government, and Fidel Castro would crumble like a stage set made of cardboard. It wasn't supposed to look like a U.S. invasion. It wasn't supposed to look like the CIA. It certainly wasn't supposed to look like failure. Men in clean suits and polished shoes sat in conference rooms and nodded with confidence. They had spreadsheets. They had maps. They had theories. But theories don't bleed. The men Johnny knew did. He wasn't at the Bay of Pigs. He didn't carry a rifle or storm the beach. But what happened there changed everything around him. The plan, called Operation Zapata, looked beautiful on paper. A small Cuban strike force, trained secretly in Guatemala, backed by aircraft that would pretend not to be American, with the silent permission of men who pretended not to exist. It was a coup masked as rebellion. Except rebellion doesn't work when the people you expect to rebel don't even know it's happening. Johnny watched all this from a place both close and distant. He wasn't in the war rooms, but he heard everything the moment it left them. The CIA argued with the Pentagon. The Pentagon argued with the State Department. The White House argued mostly with itself. But no one argued with reality, which was Castro was ready. He had spies in Miami. He had eyes in Havana. He had ears in living rooms belonging to exiles, priests, dancers, and even some of the very men the CIA trusted. Before the first boat even touched the beach, Castro knew. He was waiting. The invasion began at dawn on April 17, 1961. It was quiet at first, then loud, then too loud. The Cuban troops didn't panic. They pushed back. Hard. A handful of exiles tried to fight. A few tried to retreat. Some just tried to survive. The promised air support didn't come. The promised uprising never started. The promised victory drowned in salt water and gunfire. Castro didn't just win. He humiliated. Vanity doesn't collapse easily. The CIA's first instinct wasn't to admit defeat. It was to erase it. They tried to hide involvement. But Johnny knew, and everyone in his world knew, that hiding a failure was harder than hiding a crime. Bodies talk louder than money. He watched as Washington fell into a panic. Power turned to confusion. Politicians demanded answers while pretending they had never approved the mission. Some blamed intelligence. Some blamed planning. Some blamed bad luck. Quietly, some blamed history. But nobody blamed themselves. Johnny saw something different. He didn't see failure. He saw fracture. Trust, once so carefully hidden between crime and government, began to split. Not loudly, not explosively, but in quiet, dangerous ways. Everyone began asking not what went wrong, but who knew too much. Sam Giancana ranted in Chicago, pacing in expensive shoes, promising that if the CIA could mess up an invasion, how could they ever finish a hit job? Santo Trafficani watched the Havana news reels from a grim bar in Miami, drinking slowly as he watched Castro showcased like a conquering hero. The cameras showed captured weapons, broken boats, and scare prisoners. Then they showed something more dangerous than all of that. Castro, smiling, waving a cigar, telling the world that America had tried and failed to kill an idea. He didn't say Johnny's name. He didn't have to. That night in Miami, Johnny sat in a quiet hotel room with 2 men from Washington, both looking pale. They didn't offer him money. They didn't offer him immunity. They offered something rarer: honesty. They admitted the agency had underestimated Castro. They admitted they needed the mob more than ever. They admitted that the Bay of Pigs didn't stop anything. It only made it personal. The room was still. He could feel the change. Until then, the CIA only asked for help. Now, they asked for revenge. Johnny didn't like revenge. Revenge implied emotion. Emotion destroyed discipline. He understood something far more useful. Castro could not merely be killed. He had to be shattered, broken publicly, silenced privately. His myth is important as his body. They wanted Operation Mongoose to be bigger. They wanted networks, safe houses, explosive experts, microphones, planes. They wanted the mob to build something the government could deny, yet rely on. It was no longer an operation. It was an ecosystem. Castro would be hunted not by armies, but by shadows. But something had changed in Johnny too. He no longer believed that removing Castro was purely strategic. He saw the personal motivations, pain, humiliation, rage. These were poor foundations for precision. He remembered his old Chicago mentors telling him, "Never do business with someone who hurts more than they think. They make noise. They make mistakes." Sam Giancana wanted blood. Trafficani wanted Cuba back. Washington wanted erasure. Johnny wanted control. Control was slipping. The CIA began pushing more aggressively. More meetings. More calls. More desperation. They asked for plans that weren't ready. They asked for money that didn't exist. They asked Johnny to speed up what cannot be rushed. They treated assassination like an exam they needed to pass before midterms. Johnny tried to slow it down. He recommended precision, modesty, patience. Giancana called that weakness. The CIA called it caution. Johnny called it survival. Operation Mongoose grew teeth. Not sharp ones, reckless ones. The CIA began hiring freelancers. Men who loved chaos more than money. Idealists. Mercenaries. Paranoid dreamers. They were not careful. They talked too much. Some bragged. Some vanished. Some turned up in Havana prisons. Trust fractured. One day in Miami, a CIA deputy asked Johnny a question that felt like an insult. "How do we know we can trust your people?" Johnny didn't answer. He didn't need to. That same afternoon, he met with Giancana, who asked a similar question, just worded differently. "How do we know we can trust your government?" Johnny smiled slightly. Different men, same fear. Operation Mongoose was no longer a mission. It was becoming a ghost. It was becoming the kind of job that left no winners, only survivors. One afternoon, while sitting in a hotel bar in Los Angeles, Johnny overheard a young producer talking loudly after too many cocktails, telling an actress that he'd heard a rumor about the CIA hiring the mob to kill a foreign leader. An actress laughed, thinking it was a movie pitch. People always laugh at truth when it looks too much like fiction. Johnny put down his drink and left the bar. His worlds were bleeding into each other. Las Vegas was still humming with music and money. Hollywood was still glowing with spotlights and scandals. Washington was still whispering in hallways. But something had changed beneath the surface. A new kind of silence. A silence not built on control, but on fear. Fear of discovery. Fear of exposure. Fear of each other. Johnny sat alone that night, staring at the city lights flickering against the hotel window. He could hear Las Vegas in the distance, laughing, dealing cards, promising fortunes. He could hear Havana across the water, proud, taunting, untouchable. And he could hear Washington, paranoid, embarrassed, restless. There was no turning back. The CIA wouldn't walk away. The mob wouldn't walk away. Nobody would walk away from something this big, something this secret, something this dangerous. And then, like a whisper through all three worlds, came a new thought. A thought more explosive than any bomb. If we can't remove Castro from Cuba, can we remove Castro from history? That question didn't appear in a document. It appeared in a glance. A hint. A sideways suggestion. A possibility. One day, it wouldn't be Castro people whispered about. It would be another man. A man thousands of miles away. A man not in Havana. A man in Dallas. And when that day came, Johnny Roselli would realize that secrets don't just hide history. They write it. Chapter 8. Roselli, JFK, and Conspiracy Shadows. It began not with a shot, but with a look. A quiet realization in a Miami hotel room. Long before the motorcade. Long before the grassy knoll. Long before history echoed with what-ifs and maybes. It was just a look passed between men who were already entangled in too many secrets, who had planned too many schemes, who had crossed too many lines between patriotism and power. That look didn't say it directly, but it asked something dangerous. Could the same machine built to remove Castro ever be turned inward? Could a weapon designed for the Cold War ever be aimed at home? Johnny Roselli saw that question coming before most men even knew it existed. He watched as Washington, Chicago, Havana, and Las Vegas slowly became connected not by alliances, but by suspicions. For years, he had managed the impossible. He had kept criminals, politicians, spy masters, and entertainers believing they were united by purpose. But Operation Mongoose, once a mission, had become a maze. Nobody knew who worked for whom anymore. Loyalties twisted. Information flowed too freely. The mob knew too much about the government. The CIA knew too much about the mob. And Johnny, he knew too much about both. President John F. Kennedy had inherited a Cold War that was angry, expensive, and deeply scared. Washington blamed Eisenhower for Castro, blamed the CIA for the Bay of Pigs, blamed Havana for humiliating America. But whispers said something else. Some men didn't blame a country. Some blamed one man, Castro. If Castro could be removed, maybe everything would reset. Maybe Cuba would open a business. To casinos. To money. To leverage. That is why Johnny stayed involved. For him, it was never about ideology. It was about order. But then something changed. John F. Kennedy began to push back on the very men who once helped him. Everyone in Johnny's world remembered that, in 1960, Kennedy had courted mob-connected unions, mob-linked Chicago precincts, and had benefited from quiet support that left no fingerprints, but moved thousands of votes. He had never met Johnny, but he had met Johnny's influence. He owed something. Not money, not favors. Something more dangerous. Implied gratitude. But gratitude evaporates in Washington the moment you take the oath. Kennedy appointed his brother, Robert, as Attorney General, and Robert was not interested in alliances. He was interested in crusades. He went after corruption, after the unions, after organized gambling, after Sam Giancana, after Santo Trafficante, after the men Johnny once recruited into the Shadow War. The Kennedy brothers weren't just closing doors. They were burning them. Unknown to Robert, the CIA was still using those same men. Illegally. Off the books. And now, those men understood something bone-chilling. They were being hunted by the same people who secretly hired them. Johnny saw this before anyone else did. He saw it written across Giancana's face, shock and humiliation. Men like Giancana didn't fear jail. Or rivals. They feared being used and then discarded. Sam's usual swagger faded into paranoia. He said things he shouldn't. Out loud. In front of people who listened too carefully. He asked, if they can use us to kill a foreign head of state, what makes you think they wouldn't kill one of their own? People laughed when he said that, but some didn't. Johnny watched as something dark entered the room. Unspoken, but unmistakable. Not a plan. Not a plot. A question. Would history ever allow a president to die for the sake of national security? He hated the question. It wasn't precise. It wasn't clean. It didn't belong to the world he built. One where favors balanced, alliances held, and secrets protected their owners. This question had no balance. It cannot be contained. It could only grow. And grow it did. The CIA never asked that question aloud. Men like Giancana did. Men like Trafficante did. They whispered about betrayal, hypocrisy, humiliation. They saw Kennedy not as a leader, but as a liability. Meanwhile, the CIA saw Kennedy not as a liability, but as an obstacle. Two groups, one emotion, frustration. But frustration breeds noise. And Johnny despised noise. In 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended without Castro falling, without Havana burning, without any meaningful result for the men who risked everything, something shattered. The CIA's obsession with Castro no longer felt like strategy. It felt like resentment. The mob's hatred of Robert Kennedy no longer felt like defense. It felt like vengeance. Johnny found himself in rooms where men spoke less like soldiers and more like gamblers. They talked odds, probability, risk, and always about exposure. Fidel Castro, now emboldened, gave an interview to an American journalist. He leaned back, cigar between fingers, and said with a mocking smile, "If the American leaders keep trying to kill me, I think I will kill them first. It was a performance, a taunt, but also a seed. In Miami, that quote was replayed like a haunting drumbeat. Some began to ask if Castro knew more than the CIA had assumed. Some began to wonder if Havana had moles, if Castro had infiltrated the operation, if he knew the names of the very men hired to kill him. A chilling rumor emerged. Castro knew about Giancana. Castro knew about Trafficani. Castro knew about Roselli. That rumor terrified both the CIA and the mob. Because if Castro knew those names, what stopped him from saying another? Kennedy. Johnny sat in rooms lit only by ashtrays and dread, realizing that he was now stuck in a historical undertow. He wasn't planning anything. He was preventing something. He was trying to keep the mob from believing it could treat the U.S. presidency like Havana, and he was trying to keep the CIA from believing that murder could solve policy. He failed at both. In late 1963, something shifted, quietly, subtly. You could not see it in headlines, but you could feel it in phone calls, in canceled meetings, in sudden disappearances. Something was moving. The day John F. Kennedy went to Dallas, Johnny was thousands of miles away. He was in Los Angeles, discussing film deals, union contracts, and the usual blend of real business and invisible money. He stood by a hotel bar when a clerk turned up the radio. Johnny listened. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He didn't exhale. Because he already knew. Not who. Not how. Not even why. He knew only one thing. It had finally happened. The line had been crossed. The impossible had become possible. And the unthinkable had become irreversible. People say big moments arrive with thunder. This one arrived like a whisper. Nobody pointed fingers at first. Nobody dared. But behind curtains, behind diner booths, behind thick oak doors, men began to ask, was this vengeance? Was this strategy? Was this a message? Answers were scarce, but assumptions multiplied. The mob suspected the CIA. The CIA suspected the mob. Washington suspected both. Rumors spread that Castro had struck back. Others believed the mob had finally punished the Kennedys. Some believed the CIA eliminated a liability. Some believed Vice President Lyndon Johnson knew something no one else did. Some believed nothing. Some believed everything. But Johnny Roselli understood something different. Nobody could prove anything, but everybody could suggest something. That was more powerful. That was more dangerous. He became the keeper of something he never asked for, a secret without an owner. He could feel eyes on him. FBI, CIA, journalists, senators, gangsters. Everyone wanted to know what he knew. Not because they thought he'd done it, but because they feared he could explain it. He didn't explain anything. He just watched as the world tore itself apart, trying to understand what had happened in Dallas. But deep down, he knew the truth. The real danger wasn't in what happened. The real danger was that nobody knew who could do it again. His life, once a steady series of agreements, balances, and silent alliances, had become something else entirely. He was no longer a middleman. He was now a loose end. And loose ends, in both Washington and Chicago, are not permitted to exist. His phone rang less. His invitations stopped coming. And somewhere in that growing silence, he heard it, the echo of that same question. Not could Castro be killed, but could secrets be? Soon, Washington would come for answers. And then, even worse, Hollywood would. Because conspiracy, like cinema, sells. And Johnny Roselli was about to become the story. Chapter 9. Las Vegas cracks down. The mob's paradise ends. Vegas didn't collapse with gunfire. It didn't end with a raid, or a siren, or a burst of violence. No, Las Vegas began to die, quietly, like a dream that starts fading not because you wake up, but because someone else turns on the light. That someone wasn't the mob. It wasn't Hollywood. It wasn't even Washington. It was something more powerful, more subtle, and more dangerous than all three. It was legitimacy. Corporate America. Men without fedoras, without nicknames, without suspicion. Men who didn't threaten, didn't brag, and didn't show their hands because they didn't need to. They clasped them neatly across tables in boardrooms. They smiled into cameras. They signed documents. They read profit reports instead of police reports. They didn't make hits. They made acquisitions. Johnny Roselli saw those men long before most of his associates did. He saw them when they first strolled into hotel lobbies, dressed not like gamblers or gangsters, but like accountants on vacation. They used words like expansion, franchise, investment. They asked quiet questions like, who exactly owns this casino? They noticed unusual cash movements, unusual accounting patterns, unusually friendly floor managers. They asked why profits never matched foot traffic. They watched. They waited. And Johnny noticed something he hadn't seen before in Vegas. Questions. That was the beginning. It was the 1960s. Sinatra still sang at the Sands. Dean Martin still poured jokes like whiskey. Stars still glittered across the Strip. Hotels flashed their lights like promises. But something had changed beneath the glow. Vegas no longer belonged to the men who built it. It belonged to the men who wanted to buy it. Legally. The era of the skim, the elegant theft, the disappearing money, the silent business was cracking. And it wasn't cracking loudly. It was leaking. Slowly. Through ledgers. Through investigations. Through the one thing the mob never truly learned to fear. Paper. Johnny always understood that Vegas wasn't built with retaliation. It was built with restraint. It wasn't about stealing as much as possible. It was about taking as much as you could without anyone noticing. The skim was never supposed to be greedy. It was supposed to be invisible. But men got greedy. Money started missing in larger amounts. Schemes got sloppy. Money that should have vanished silently now disappeared loudly, like a falling chandelier. Men began to talk. Some bragged. Some whispered. Some panicked. Johnny stayed calm. He had always known Vegas would become too big to stay hidden. He once said to a friend, casinos don't get raided. They get bought. He wasn't wrong. Howard Hughes arrived in Vegas like a gust of clean wind. Polite, quiet, calculated. He didn't care about the skim. He cared about the Strip. He bought the Sands. Then the Desert Inn. Then Frontier. Nobody noticed at first that he wasn't just buying hotels. He was buying the mob out of Las Vegas. Johnny didn't resist Hughes. He didn't resent him. He respected him. Unlike most of Johnny's associates, Hughes didn't challenge him. He didn't try to overpower him. He simply didn't need him. Hughes was the future. A future that didn't need men like Johnny anymore. Vegas, he once said, wasn't a gamble. It was a franchise. The FBI agreed. Operation Strawman began quietly. Agents followed money, not men. They didn't kick down doors. They subpoenaed records. They didn't threaten casino managers. They audited them. They didn't chase bagmen down alleys. They requested banking statements and waited for someone to panic. Someone eventually did. The FBI found proof of skimming. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just numbers too clean to be honest. Johnny knew when he saw those numbers in a briefing that the skim wasn't just discovered. It was dying. Because once numbers begin to talk, no one can silence them without looking guilty. The Chicago outfit was restless. Men like Giancana, once untouchable, were now being followed, recorded, cornered. The FBI didn't need informants anymore. Casino ledgers were doing the talking. In Cleveland, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Chicago, quiet meetings turned tense. Some men wanted to pull out of Vegas completely. Others wanted to reclaim control the old-fashioned way. Threats, bullets, disappearances. Old men muttered, Vegas belongs to us, like priests clinging to dying scripture. But Vegas didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to whoever could print contracts. Johnny found himself straddling two worlds again. Not Hollywood and the mob this time, but the past and the future. He was too close to Washington to be trusted by Chicago. Too close to Chicago to be trusted by Washington. And too quiet, too calm, too polished to be fully believed by either. He had become the rarest of all things. A man too valuable to eliminate, too dangerous to fully protect, and too informed to ignore. He remembered sitting alone in the lounge of the Sands, watching the cocktail waitresses move gracefully through the neon haze. That place, that glittering palace of linen suits and hidden ledgers, had been an improbable experiment once. Mobsters building a castle in the desert. He watched now as the dealers smiled, the dice rolled, the singers sang. Everything was perfect. Yet beneath it all, the city was eating its own creators. The more legitimate Las Vegas became, the more illegitimate its founders felt. The public saw glamour. They saw celebrities, spotlights, and Sinatra playing to packed crowds. They didn't see the fear. The fear lived behind closed doors. It lived in conference calls, in late-night meetings, in closed sessions where older men asked quiet, dangerous questions. Who talks now? Who can still be trusted? Who knows too much? Johnny knew the answer. Everyone was talking, because the walls were talking. The days when a casino could be skimmed clean without trace were over. Cameras saw everything. Accountants recorded everything. Even when skimming persisted, it didn't feel like business anymore. It felt like risk. Naked, reckless risk. Las Vegas had never been risky for Johnny. He always made sure of that. He was never sloppy, never loud, never greedy. He treated Vegas like a diamond, beautiful, fragile, and easily ruined if handled without precision. Vegas was never Vegas because of violence. It was Vegas because of balance. But balance had a lifespan, and its expiration date had arrived. One night over drinks in Los Angeles, a Hollywood producer told Johnny a joke. "You built the dream. Now you're being priced out of it." Johnny didn't laugh. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it was true. For the first time, he wasn't just an outsider. He was outdated. The FBI called him soon after, not as a suspect or a witness, but as something more complex. They asked questions he shouldn't know the answers to. He gave answers that weren't quite answers. A delicate dance like everything he had ever done. But he could feel the tone shifting. No longer gentle. No longer curious. Now hungry. Vegas was changing, and so were its enemies. By the mid-1970s, the old guard was being indicted, arrested, replaced. Some turned informants. Some vanished. Some kept fighting, but their battles looked more desperate than strategic. They clung to Las Vegas like it was a memory they weren't ready to accept was gone. But Johnny didn't cling. He walked away. Not loudly. Not bitterly. Just quietly. He didn't retire. He didn't disappear. He simply stopped showing up in places where history had already moved on. He began spending more time in Los Angeles. Miami. Las Vegas still glittered, but it wasn't his kind of glitter anymore. It was bright. Loud. Sanitized. Vegas was safe now. Protected. Watched. And if Vegas was safe, men like Johnny weren't. The most dangerous moment in a man's life, he once believed, was when he was hunted. But he learned something new. The most dangerous moment was when he was no longer needed. Because that's when people started asking not, how useful is he? But instead, how risky? That question would follow him into his next chapter. Not in a casino. Not in a studio. Not in Havana or Washington. It would follow him to a Senate hearing room. With microphones. With cameras. With names he wasn't supposed to say. And one question waiting for him. "Mr. Roselli, what exactly did you do for your country?" He smiled. But not because he was amused. He smiled because he finally understood. He hadn't just been part of history. He had been its loose thread. And in the chapters ahead, someone would begin pulling. Chapter 10. Senate Investigations. The Church Committee. He had walked into 1,000 rooms before. Rooms filled with gangsters who didn't blink, with CIA men who didn't smile, with Washington lawyers who didn't breathe unless clear to do so. But this room felt different. More dangerous. Not because it was violent, but because it was public. Cameras. Microphones. Notebooks. Names written down. Things recorded permanently. Not whispered. Truth didn't scare Johnny Roselli. But permanence did. It was 1975. Washington had decided that it was time to peel back the curtain. There had been too many secrets, too many rumors, too many men whispering about Castro, the mob, the CIA, the plots, the money, the assassinations. A senator named Frank Church launched a committee to investigate covert operations, plans, deals, crimes the U.S. government would never admit to. Assassination attempts, vote manipulation, hidden wars, and the question nobody wanted to answer. Had the CIA ever tried to kill a foreign leader? And worse, had they ever asked criminals to help? Johnny did not plan to be part of that answer. But he was. He was summoned, not invited, subpoenaed. That word felt colder than a bullet. A subpoena meant that silence was no longer a choice. It meant the government was no longer pretending. They wanted answers. On the record. Under oath. He arrived calm. Always calm. He wore a dark suit. Not flashy. Not defiant. Not apologetic. The tie was plain. The shoes polished. But the eyes, those remained unreadable. He walked past armed guards, past aides carrying binders thick with redacted pages, past senators adjusting their microphones, past journalists who scribbled without blinking. Some of them had researched his life. They knew his rumored ties to Hollywood, Las Vegas, Chicago, and Washington. They knew he had smoked cigars with studio heads, shaken hands with Teamster bosses, and sat quietly at tables where people didn't take notes. He sat down, placed his hands gently on the table. He did not look nervous. He looked prepared. Senator Church looked at him like a man studying a locked safe. "Mr. Roselli," he said slowly, "we understand you were involved in some informal conversations between individuals associated with organized crime and individuals associated with intelligence services." Johnny tilted his head slightly. Informal conversations. That was one way to describe plots to poison a foreign leader. He didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting order. The delicate order he had spent 3 decades building. Between criminals, politicians, executives, and shadow operatives who lived in the spaces between laws. He knew something the senators didn't. If you break certain secrets, they don't simply spill. They infect. "Senator," he said calmly, "I did speak with certain government officials about certain matters. But those gentlemen understood that what was discussed was off the record. It was national security. Nobody took notes. Now the room didn't breathe. Senators exchanged glances. Some leaned forward. Some leaned back. Some stopped writing. Reporters' pens hovered like scalpel blades. Johnny had not admitted anything, but he had admitted everything. He could feel the ripple. He had just confirmed what America suspected, what Havana had claimed, what whispered conversations had suggested for years. The CIA had asked the mob to help kill Fidel Castro. Not the movies, not the magazines, the United States government. And they had asked the Underworld. He didn't say he planted bombs. He didn't say he handed poison. He didn't say he recruited killers. He said simply, "I was asked for access." Access. The senators knew what that word meant. Not guns. Not explosives. Access meant men. Resources. Connections. Deniability. It meant they didn't need Johnny to do violence. They needed him to introduce it. He answered carefully. Never too much. Never too little. He told them about meetings in Miami hotels. About men with no names, no badges, no official positions. He told them about declarations spoken quietly, like prayers, that Castro had to go. He mentioned code words, meetings, silent agreements. He never mentioned dates. He never mentioned amounts. But he mentioned enough. At one point, Senator Church leaned in and asked, "Mr. Roselli, were you under the impression that the mob would receive special treatment in return for its cooperation?" Johnny looked at him without blinking. "I was under the impression," he said, "that this was about the country, not about favors." A lie? Maybe. Maybe not. The truth was, the mob believed the government would close cases, ignore wiretaps, forget indictments. The truth was, the CIA believed the mob would behave like soldiers, obedient, disciplined, silent. The truth was, both sides hated each other, used each other, mistrusted each other, and depended on each other anyway. As he spoke, Johnny watched something quietly unravel in that room. It wasn't him. It wasn't the CIA. It wasn't even the government. It was the illusion that America had always operated above the shadows, that its battles were fought honorably, that its orders were clean. He had lifted the curtain. Just enough. Not too much. Just enough to show that behind the presidential seal lived human decisions. Insecure, fearful, improvisational. The kind of decisions that got made when national dignity clashed with global embarrassment. When Castro laughed on television, cigars in hand. When newspapers mocked the Bay of Pigs. When Soviets whispered in Havana. When pressure became panic, that's when they called the mob. Not because they loved them, but because they resembled something America needed. Men without identity. Men without records. Men who could fail without headlines. Johnny left the hearing that day, knowing something had changed. He had become known. Not by gangsters. Not by criminals. He had been known before, in those circles. But now, he had become known by America. Every major newspaper printed his name. Not as legend. Not as criminal. As question. The New York Times wrote, "Who is John Roselli?" The Chicago Tribune wrote, "The mobster who met the CIA." The Washington Post wrote, "The shadow between two worlds." For the first time in his life, he was a headline. He was no longer invisible. And he knew that was fatal. Because headlines get cut out. Headlines get saved. Headlines get remembered. Headlines get people killed. After leaving Washington, he went back to Los Angeles. But something was different. The old lounges had changed. Men who once nodded now hesitated. Old hosts didn't seat him at his usual tables. Nightclubs felt loud now. People whispered too much. Questions floated in the air like dust. No one asked him directly, but many waited for him to speak. He didn't. He went to Vegas for a while. Watched the new casinos grow like polished replicas of the ones he helped build. Except now, the money was clean. The dealers smiled like employees, not accomplices. There were no envelopes sliding under tables. No whispers around cash cages. No envelopes for Chicago, Kansas City, Tampa, or Cleveland. Vegas had become honest, which to Johnny meant it had also become boring. He would walk through hotel lobbies and remember how they used to feel. Suspenseful, electric, controlled, like performances on a stage where every role was assigned, every line rehearsed, every lie believable. Now, Vegas wasn't a performance. It was a business. Johnny had never been interested in business. He'd been interested in balance. The balance was gone. He moved quietly again. Los Angeles, Miami, a brief stop in New York. He avoided interviews, declined comment. But history didn't care. Reporters chased rumors like gamblers chased jackpots. He had spoken carefully, but too well. He had shown just enough. And that made everyone nervous. Not only the CIA, not only the mob. History itself now feared what Johnny Roselli might say next. He wasn't a danger because of what he had done. He was dangerous because he had become the only translator between two worlds that never wanted to understand each other. He hadn't exposed them. He had verified them. And for the first time in his life, Johnny Roselli understood. Silence wasn't protection anymore. It was risk. He knew what came next. Not a hearing. Not a headline. Something quieter. Something final. Something that looked less like punishment and more like erasure. He didn't fear being killed. He feared being deleted. One morning in Miami, reading a newspaper headline about a possible second inquiry, he whispered to himself, "They won't let me testify again." He was right. Chapter 11. The Final Betrayal. Roselli talks too much. Some men die loudly. Bullets, headlines, chaos. Others die quietly, vanishing into files, rumors, deniable history. Johnny Roselli had always believed he would be one of the quiet ones. Not because he feared death. He didn't. But because he understood something far more dangerous. That certain men do not get killed for what they have done. They get killed for what they might yet say. After his first Senate appearance, the world had changed around him. People stopped speaking in full sentences around him. Conversations that once welcomed him now fell silent when he entered the room. He could feel it happening. Not instantly, but slowly, like a glass cracking along invisible lines. Old friends avoided eye contact. New acquaintances acted too friendly, as if friendliness were a mask for fear. Johnny could sense that people no longer saw him as an asset. They saw him as something else, something far more volatile, a witness. He felt it most in Los Angeles. Hollywood had embraced him for decades, not because it loved him, but because it trusted him to be invisible. Now, he had stepped into the light, even if only briefly, and even if he had revealed very little. He had confirmed too much simply by existing. He had proven that the lines between government, mob, money, and power weren't imaginary. They were real. They had been walked by men like him. Men who never left records, until now. Johnny began receiving polite invitations. Not from Chicago. Not for Vegas. From Washington. The second Senate hearing was coming, and this one would not just ask about Castro. It would ask about Dallas. It would ask about loyalty. It would ask about betrayal. It would ask questions that people did not want asked, and Johnny knew that if they asked him, he would have to answer carefully. But the truth was, he didn't know if he could answer safely. Because by now, there were no safe answers. He met with a former associate in Miami, a man who had been close to several of the intelligence facilitators who ran Operation Mongoose. The man didn't meet him in a hotel bar or country club. He met him on a fishing pier at dusk, speaking softly while pelicans watched from wooden posts. The man did not offer advice. He offered a warning. People don't worry about what you've done, he said. People worry about what you know. Johnny didn't argue. That was the problem. People thought he knew everything. In truth, he only knew pieces, fragments, flares of moments, conversations that didn't belong to any one person. But that was worse. Someone who knows everything can be discredited. Someone who knows only pieces cannot be disproven. He tried to focus on life. He visited Las Vegas again, not to attend meetings, but to remember. To walk through familiar corridors and listen to the music of lost empires. Roulette spins, cocktail glasses, Sinatra rehearsing soundcheck behind closed doors. But Vegas didn't sound the same. The casino lights were brighter now, but the shadows were gone. And Johnny had always lived in shadows. He spoke occasionally to his old associates, those who hadn't vanished or been incarcerated. They spoke in polite fragments, always measured, always cautious. Nobody said, "Be careful." They didn't have to. It hung silently, in every pause between words. He noticed something else. Nobody asked him what he would say in the next hearing. Not because they weren't curious, but because curiosity was dangerous now. One night in an LA restaurant, a man he had known for years, never close, but never distant, took off his hat and said quietly, "You hear the one about the piano player?" Johnny looked back at him without expression. "A piano player walks into a bar," the man said, "and he tells everyone he knows where the bodies are buried because he's played at every funeral." He paused, longer than necessary. Pretty soon, nobody asked him to play anymore. No one needed to explain the meaning. Johnny was no longer charming. He was no longer valuable. He was risky. In the underworld, danger can be seen, calculated, prepared for. But risk is different. Risk is not a person. Risk is not a threat. Risk is a question. Is it better to keep him alive or remove him from the equation? It happened subtly, and Johnny didn't miss it. He began noticing unfamiliar faces in familiar places. People he didn't know, who seemed to know him. Faces in airport lounges. Cars with tinted windows behind taxis. Men lingering too long at newsstands without buying anything. It wasn't constant. It wasn't panic-inducing. It was just enough. Enough to remind him. You were being watched. Not hunted. Not chased. Watched. And watching is worse, because it means someone still hasn't decided what to do with you. He was called again. This time, not to a grand Senate hearing, but to a quiet deposition in Washington. Smaller room. No cameras. No lights. No public spectacle. Just sworn testimony. Private. Confidential. Protected. Permanent. That was the word that unsettled him. Permanent. He took a plane east on April 1st, 1976. The air felt different this time. Not the anxious excitement of previous trips, but something colder, heavier. A man who had worked briefly in Cuban intelligence sat beside him on the flight. Not by coincidence, not by intention, but by fate's twisted sense of irony. He didn't speak to Johnny, but he looked at him with something between pity and fear. Johnny knew why. They both understood that information is never free. It is borrowed from the future. The deposition was quiet, controlled. He was asked names, places, years, not about his life, about other people's lives. He gave answers carefully. He used words like maybe, possibly, purportedly, language that planted suspicion but not conviction. But some things he acknowledged. He mentioned Giancana. He mentioned trafficking. He mentioned CIA contacts without identifying them. He mentioned ideas that had been spoken about, never formalized, never approved. When he left, there are no handcuffs, no indictment. Not yet. But the look in the investigator's eyes said it for him. He had confirmed the myth. He had confirmed that Operation Mongoose was real. He had confirmed that the government had used criminals to try to kill Castro. He had confirmed that there were other operations, unofficial, undocumented, untraceable, operations that had been discussed without being executed. He had confirmed too much, not by what he revealed, but by what he hadn't. After Washington, he flew back to Miami, rented a small apartment near the water. Not hidden, not luxurious, just ordinary. For once, he seemed almost content, walking the shoreline in linen shirts, smoking fewer cigarettes, sleeping more. At night, he played cards with retired hotel managers and men who had no idea who he had once been. But his past wasn't done. A final subpoena arrived. He was to appear again, and this time, it would not be quiet. It would be televised. He didn't tell anyone, but someone already knew. 3 weeks before his next hearing, he got a call. No threat, no warning, just a message. Don't go boating, a voice whispered. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He knew, but he went anyway, because that was his nature. Some men live by survival. Johnny had always lived by structure. When he stepped onto the boat that July afternoon at the Miami Marina, it was sunny, calm, almost peaceful. The man he met wasn't a stranger, but he wasn't a friend either. He carried no gun, no rope. No rope was necessary. Things like this don't happen with guns. They happen with weight. They found a steel drum 10 days later, floating near Dumfoundling Bay. It didn't scream murder. It whispered message. No fingerprints. No wallet. No name. Only silence. The perfect ending for a man who lived in it. Johnny once said, "The worst thing isn't being killed. The worst thing is being erased." He was wrong. The worst thing is being erased. And then suddenly remembered. Because even now, long after the drum sank, long after the hearings closed, long after the files were sealed, the questions remain. Who ordered it? Who feared him most? Was it Chicago? Was it Langley? Or was it both? And if both feared him, what exactly did he know? The answer lies somewhere between crime and country, between loyalty and survival, between silence and history. The answer lies, as it always did, with the man nobody was supposed to see. Handsome Johnny, the man who talked just enough to be killed, but not quite enough to be forgotten. Chapter 12. Murder on the High Seas. In death, he became exactly what he had been in life, unconfirmed, a ghost of fact, a rumor wearing perfectly tailored clothing. The body wasn't even discovered at first, just a drum, a rusted, ordinary steel drum bobbing gently in the warm July waters of Dumfoundling Bay, off the Florida coast. Fishermen saw it floating near the mangroves. They thought it held trash. They dragged it to shore. It didn't smell like trash. It smelled like ending. When they pried it open, what came out wasn't horror. It wasn't violence. It was silence. A silence so eerie, it felt like something deeply classified. No wallet, no ID, no fingerprints. Just a dismembered man in expensive clothing and a watch worth more than the boat that found him. No official name attached. But for those who understood the underworld, it didn't need one. It was final proof that the man who knew too much and spoke too carefully had finally become too dangerous to keep alive. John, handsome Johnny Roselli. The news didn't break like an explosion. It spread slowly, like fog slipping through alleyways, through casinos, through government offices, into Hollywood lounges, Chicago steakhouses, and Washington think tanks. People didn't gasp when they heard his name. They paused. They nodded. They already knew, before it was confirmed, that it would end this way. A senator in Washington put down his newspaper, exhaled, and muttered, "He didn't just die. He was erased." That was true, but only half true. Johnny hadn't been erased. He had been redacted. The oldest men in Chicago said little. They didn't speak Johnny's name, not because they feared it, but because they understood it. The highest levels of the CIA issued no public response. Off the record, someone said, "We don't comment on false associations." In Las Vegas, cocktail waitresses whispered. Dealers shook their heads. Sinatra simply frowned and looked away when asked. Hollywood pretended not to know him. But Hollywood always knew him. The last weeks of his life were not chaotic. They were surprisingly calm. He walked the beaches in Miami, played cards at night with retired men who didn't ask about his past. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He didn't seem afraid. But he was waiting, not for death, for decision. Someone somewhere was deciding what to do about him. The Senate's church committee had called him once. He had told them just enough. Not about murders or plots or conspiracies, but about presence. He confirmed that secret meetings happened, that the mob was approached, that Castro was targeted, that national security sometimes wears cufflinks instead of badges. He didn't betray secrets. He simply acknowledged their existence. But now the committee wanted him back. And this time, they wanted names. That was what changed the equation. Johnny wasn't murdered because of what he said. He was murdered because of what he might say. He knew the risk. The older he grew, the more he understood a brutal truth. Loyalty has an expiration date. And for men like him, silence isn't a virtue. It's a gamble. Eventually, everyone stops betting on you. They didn't kill him for being a gangster. They didn't kill him for being an informant. They didn't even kill him for being a witness. They killed him because he was the last man alive who could connect three worlds: Hollywood, the mob, and the CIA, without speculation. He could confirm it. He was dangerous because he could make conspiracy sound like fact. He went missing on July 28, 1976. He didn't vanish in an alley or on a lonely road. He disappeared on a boat. A friend, someone nobody could fully identify, had invited him for a day of fishing out on Biscayne Bay. He dressed well. He arrived on time. He stepped onto the boat. That was the last time he was seen alive. No panic. No struggle. No noise. They didn't shoot him. They didn't strangle him. They had time. They had patience. They had planning. He disappeared, not into darkness, but into process. First, the removal of identity. No wallet. No papers. No fingerprints. His hands were removed to ensure that. His legs, too, for easier disposal. He was dismembered like a secret, neatly, piece by piece. Then, the choice of burial. Not desert. Not forest. Water. Water erases. Water cleans. Water forgets. But not this time. Weeks later, a steel drum washed ashore. It was sealed tight, as if it held toxic waste. In a way it did. Human history sometimes becomes toxic when it lingers too long. When authorities opened it, they found what the killers had hoped they would never find. Something identifiable. His watch. Custom-made. He always liked nice watches. He always believed time was something a man should wear proudly. In the end, that watch revealed everything. The body was cremated quickly, quietly. No full funeral. No official obituary. But there was one strange thing. People mourned him. Gangsters mourned him. Government men mourned him. Even Hollywood mourned him, quietly, behind tinted sunglasses in Beverly Hills restaurants. But none of them cried for him. They cried for what he represented. A bridge. A translator. A mediator between worlds that pretended they didn't know each other. Now, that translator was gone. There would be no second version. Because the worlds he connected learned a lesson from his death. Never use a middleman unless you're willing to bury him. Weeks after his death, two things changed. The Senate committee suddenly lost enthusiasm for re-interviewing Roselli, and the CIA quietly discontinued certain unnamed operations. People who had never met him felt something strange. Relief. The FBI closed their file formally, but not emotionally. A note was attached that read, "Subject will not be available for further questioning." In Vegas, someone placed a whiskey glass with 2 ice cubes in a quiet corner booth of the Sands. His booth. No word. No note. Just a glass. Someone whispered, "He talked once. He won't talk twice." Sinatra never spoke his name again. Dean Martin, when asked years later, simply said, "Johnny wasn't dangerous. He was too trusted. That's why he was dangerous." The CIA said nothing, which, coming from the CIA, said everything. In Washington, long after the case was closed, a man who once sat across from Johnny in a shadowed room under a government seal admitted something quietly to a colleague. He never said too much. He just made people afraid he might. Meanwhile, Chicago concluded something equally chilling. He wasn't hit for what he did. He was hit for how he lived. No mobster dies without being claimed. No agent disappears without being classified. But Johnny Roselli died in a way no one wanted to claim, because claiming him meant admitting he existed. And the most dangerous thing about Johnny Roselli was not what he knew or what he said. It was that he had proven something unthinkable, that the mob could work with the government, and the government could work with the mob. And when their work was done, neither side could afford to keep the story alive. So they didn't. They sank it. They sealed it. They floated it away. We often say history is written by winners, but sometimes history is written by those who vanish. His body was found, but his truth, that's still missing. Maybe it's at the bottom of that bay. Maybe it's locked in sealed files, waiting for some future scandal to bring it back. Or maybe now, it lives only in whispers. The kind of whispers that float between casinos and embassies, between film sets and safe houses, where someone always leans in and asks, "Did you ever hear about Handsome Johnny?" The man who knew too much and spoke just enough to never be allowed to speak again. Chapter 13. The Cover-Up. CIA or Mafia. The drum that washed ashore didn't just carry a body. It carried a question. A haunting, unclaimed, unresolved question that whispered across courtroom corridors, casino lounges, cigar smoke backrooms, and federal offices with locked filing cabinets. Who killed Johnny Roselli? It wasn't asked loudly. Loudness was too risky. It was asked quietly, carefully, like a man checking a locked door to see if it still holds. Nobody wanted to answer the question, because to answer it meant taking ownership of something much bigger than murder. It meant admitting that somewhere in the shadows, two powerful worlds, organized crime and government intelligence, had converged in ways no one wanted to explain. Journalists speculated. Some said it was the mob. Some said it was the CIA. Some said he knew too much about Castro. Some said it was about JFK. Some said Las Vegas. Some said Hollywood. Some said none of those were the reason. Some said all of them were. That was the problem. Roselli had woven a life made of secrets, not singular but overlapping, layered like glass, reflecting different truths depending on where you stood. Nobody could point to one motive, because there wasn't one motive. There was a flood of them. In Chicago, old outfit bosses sat wordlessly over whiskey, their silence more revealing than confession. No one claimed the hit. No one bragged. No one whispered, because this wasn't the kind of killing that earned stripes. It wasn't about territory, debt, betrayal, or rage. It was about maintenance, containment. It was not punishment. It was erasure. The outfit killed to protect money or power. But this was different. This felt like protecting history. In Langley, Virginia, where hallways did not echo and doors were designed not to creak, nobody spoke his name out loud. They referred to him only as the contact, never as an asset, never as a collaborator, never as a risk. Just the contact. That's what you called a man who was useful once and dangerous now. There were no official files linking him to Castro operations. But off the record, behind tinted conference room glass, people exchanged looks. Looks that held more fear than guilt. Because guilt could be denied. But fear? Fear meant something still existed. Something still breathing. Somewhere between Chicago and Langley, Johnny had passed through an invisible gate. No longer criminal, not officially political, but something in between. He had become inconvenient. That word trails men like quiet poison. Once you become inconvenient, you can't negotiate, can't intimidate, can't disappear on your own terms. Someone else disappears you. Whispers traveled strangely after Johnny's death. Nobody claimed responsibility, but nobody denied knowing who did it. Someone said Chicago ordered it. Someone else said Washington coordinated it. Someone else said it was Havana, Castro getting the last laugh. Dead man in a barrel. Symbolic. Cinematic. political revenge packaged like street justice. But even Castro dismissed it. "We do not throw people in barrels," he reportedly said. "That is not a revolution. That is a profession. The profession of erasure." There were patterns to the killing, clues in the method. Roselli wasn't shot and dumped in a trunk. He wasn't found in an alley with 2 bullets behind the ear, the signature. He wasn't stuffed into concrete. He wasn't left for discovery on a street as a warning. He was dismembered, sealed into a steel drum, and set afloat. Parts removed to prevent fingerprinting. Legs removed not for brutality, but for logistics. This wasn't revenge. This was protocol. Clean, efficient, methodical. It suggested professionals. But which kind? The mob had used drums before: Cleveland, New Jersey, certain Chicago jobs. Drums sink. They erase. They last. They're silent. But those jobs were almost always personal. Debts, betrayals, broken promises. Roselli's wasn't personal. Nobody hated Johnny. Hate is emotional. Killings like this aren't emotional. They're preventive. And then there was the other possibility, the one nobody wanted to consider, the possibility that both worlds worked together, that it wasn't a mob job or a government job, but a joint solution. One removing a man they no longer needed. The other removing a man they could no longer trust. An execution by agreement. Evidence. None officially, but unofficially too much. His subpoena had arrived just 2 weeks before he vanished. He was to testify before the Senate Intelligence Subcommittee regarding CIA plots to assassinate Castro. Not general questions. Specific ones. Not rumors. Names. Dates. Contacts. He was not being asked if the mob had helped. He was being asked who introduced them to the CIA, who had arranged meetings between intelligence handlers and crime bosses, who had first uttered those dangerous words. "We need men who don't exist." He knew that phrase. He had been in the room when it was said. He had repeated it. He had embodied it. Now, men on both ends of that sentence wanted it buried. In the months before his murder, Johnny had grown less cautious, some said. Maybe he felt untouchable. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he believed the end had come and gone, and he'd been spared. But he hadn't been spared. He'd been postponed. He spent those last weeks speaking a little too openly to people a little too curious. He hinted that things would soon get interesting. He told a friend, "Some big names will sweat." He told another, "They're afraid of the wrong questions." These weren't threats. They were warnings. He wasn't planning to reveal anything. But what he knew, even unsaid, was radioactive. Someone didn't want to wait and see if that radiation would spread. Police pieced together the timeline, but not the motive. That was the irony. The motive wasn't singular. It was cumulative. Mob motive. He'd risk exposing Chicago's involvement in government plans, confirming what up until then was only whispered in carefully controlled conversations. CIA motive. He could confirm that the United States government had conspired with organized crime, not only against Castro, but possibly in broader operations that pushed beyond Cuban soil, beyond Cold War boundaries, and into the darker corners of American domestic history. FBI motive. He'd shown that the Bureau had either known and done nothing, or not known and failed to uncover it. Both unacceptable. Even Hollywood had motive. He could tie film industry unions, casino financing, and federal intelligence together in a way nobody had dared to do before. Johnny's death was like a door slammed shut, not because it concealed something, but because behind that door were too many other doors. Doors leading to Havana, Hollywood, Langley, Chicago, Las Vegas, and Capitol Hill, with too many fingerprints on the handles. So who killed him? The FBI's official answer: unknown. The CIA's official answer: irrelevant. Chicago's answer: don't ask questions you don't want answered. But here's what the people close to Johnny believed. The mob could have killed him. The CIA could have killed him. But neither would have risked doing it alone. One had the motive. The other had the method. And both had something to protect. Johnny Roselli had always lived in the space between worlds. He thrived there. He profited there. He was protected there. But that meant that when those worlds finally collided, he would be trapped at the crossroads. He once said, If you're too valuable to kill, you'll live forever. If you're too dangerous to keep alive, you won't live long. He never said which one he was. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he didn't want to. In the end, perhaps the most damning, haunting question wasn't, who killed Johnny Roselli? It was, how many people needed him dead? His steel drum was never fully buried. Not physically, not historically. Because sometimes, history doesn't hide things. Sometimes, it floats them right to the surface. A reminder. A warning. A silent confession. Handsome Johnny didn't just die. He was removed. The system deleted him, but accidentally left his name behind. And that name, to this day, still asks us from the edge of history. What happens to a man who becomes the only witness? To a crime that was never supposed to exist, because it was committed by people who don't officially exist. The answer? You put him in a drum, and you pray the tide doesn't bring him back. Chapter 14, Legacy. The man who knew too much. There are men history remembers because of what they did. Others, because of what was done to them. But the rarest kind are remembered not for actions or endings, but for questions they leave behind. Johnny Roselli became one of those rare men. He didn't change history with guns, or bombs, or votes, or speeches. He changed it by making people realize how fragile the line truly is between legitimacy and crime, between patriotism and betrayal, between secrecy and conspiracy. His death did not close the book. It opened a different one. After the barrel was found, after newspapers speculated, after Senate committees whispered his name like a forbidden word, something interesting happened. He didn't fade away. He grew. Not physically, not personally, but mythically. Johnny Roselli became something he had never actually wanted to be. Famous. But his fame was not cinematic. It was unsettling. It lived not in billboards, but in classified briefings. He didn't enter culture. He entered mystery. He became a reference point, not for a single crime, but for a possibility. The possibility that the highest and lowest levels of American power might have once looked at each other and seen common cause. And that possibility, even without proof, had power. Chicago never spoke his name out loud again. Old mobsters who once laughed with him now glanced over their shoulders when someone mentioned the man in the drum. He became a cautionary tale, not about betrayal, but about visibility. In the underworld, men don't die for what they confess. They die for what they confirm simply by surviving too long. Hollywood, too, changed, although it didn't want to admit why. It didn't mourn Johnny openly, but it shifted subtly. Certain private dinners stopped happening. Certain unions suddenly became fully legitimate. Studio executives, who once considered informal assistance from men like Johnny, now avoided anything that even smelled like organized influence. Film money became cleaner, less traceable, not because it hid things, but because it no longer included things. People stopped calling men like Johnny consultants. Now, they were simply liabilities. Hollywood never feared scandal as much as it feared proof. Vegas changed even more. By the late 70s, the casinos were owned by corporations, not families. Money was counted by accountants, not skimmed by couriers. The storytellers were gone. The silence had been replaced by surveillance. There were no hidden rooms where envelopes slid across velvet tables. There were no more deals made under chandeliers. Casinos became business, not theater. The last romantic illusion of organized underworld influence had vanished. Yet, even in its disappearance, Roselli's ghost lingered, not as suspicion, but as acknowledgement. People now knew the truth. Vegas wasn't built on gambling. It was built on arrangement, on the understanding that the most profitable institutions aren't necessarily legal or illegal, but something in between, something organized. His legacy wasn't just in casinos or Hollywood or Havana. It had something to do with Washington. He exposed not documents or confessions, but something bigger. He exposed possibility. He proved that in moments of fear and national insecurity, governments might turn not to honor, but to convenience. That when nations feel cornered, they don't always call soldiers. Sometimes they call ghosts. And Johnny Roselli had been one of those ghosts. What made him dangerous was not that he knew too much. It was that he had known many different kinds of knowing. He didn't know just about mob hits. He didn't know just about casino schemes. He didn't know just about Hollywood extortion or CIA covert operations. He knew about the spaces in between. The spaces where agreements are made, silent agreements, spoken without words and sealed without signatures. It was never about murder. It was about collaboration. Writer after writer tried to distill him. Was he a criminal? Was he an intelligence asset? Was he a Hollywood manipulator? A Vegas architect? He was none of these, and all of them. He was the broker of silence, the diplomat of secrets. A senator once said, years after his death, he was the most dangerous witness because he didn't need to prove anything. His existence made it true. The CIA never commented on him officially. But one former analyst, when teaching a course on intelligence ethics, wrote a single line on the board. There are no loose ends in covert work. He never mentioned Roselli by name. He didn't need to. In mob circles, they had a different saying that appeared around the time Roselli's name vanished from conversations. If you live between two worlds, make sure both worlds believe you're loyal to them. The minute they both question it, you're gone. That was how they saw his life. But maybe his real legacy was not that he died between two worlds. His real legacy was that he proved those worlds were never truly separate. Years passed. Books were written. Documentaries produced. Many of them mentioned him, but never focused solely on him. He was always in the background, in the shadows. The supporting character in every conspiracy, a cameo role. The man behind the curtain, but never the main character. Just as he would have liked. His grave, if it could be called that, held no headstone, no tribute, just ashes recovered from the Florida medical examiner's office. Technically, officially, he did not rest under the name John Roselli. He was buried under his birth name, Filippo Sacco, a name almost no one remembered. Almost. But that was fitting, because the first lesson he learned in crime, in Hollywood, in Vegas, in intelligence, was that identity is performative. Who you are depends entirely on who's asking. Filippo Sacco, John Roselli, Handsome Johnny, visible, invisible. Every name was true, and none of them were. He became an idea, a caution, a rumor that refused to fade. In many ways, that's how he survives today. Not in photographs, but in footnotes. Unconfirmed, but always present. When historians talk about Castro plots, or CIA conspiracies, or Kennedy speculations, or Vegas scheme operations, or Hollywood unions, they don't always say his name, but they feel his fingerprints. Somewhere between every theory. The last man who truly talked to both the senators and the soldiers, to the movie producers and the mob bosses, to the gamblers and the government. He never left behind a memoir. He never wrote his version. He never defended himself. But somewhere, in the echo of his silence, you can still hear his final, whispered lesson. History isn't written by heroes or villains, winners or losers. History is written by those who understand. What must never be written down. He never told us everything. And that's exactly why we'll never forget him. He had once joked, I'll outlive all of them, even after I'm gone. Maybe he did. Because now, he isn't a man. He's the unanswered question that history can't bury. And that may be the truest definition of legacy. Chapter 15, Epilogue, A Ghost in American History. He did not chase fame. He did not seek headlines. He did not take bows under chandeliers or stand where history was publicly written. He walked in quietly, left more quietly, and yet somehow left behind something more permanent than photographs or tombstones. Johnny Roselli became part of the American story, except he didn't live in the chapters. He lived in the margins, in parentheses, in redacted lines, in gaps between testimonies, in moments when senators asked questions and witnesses looked away. He became the thing historians hate most and fear most, a gap that cannot be filled without changing the entire story. In the years after his death, America tried to move on. Vietnam faded from television screens, Nixon resigned, Watergate passed, and the headlines shifted to new scandals, new threats, new enemies. The Cold War breathed on, uneasily. But the Roselli case, his death, his burial, his questions, never quite settled. It did not explode into a conspiracy sensation. It did not vanish either. It lingered, like an unanswered phone ringing in the next room. The official agencies closed the file. The FBI ended its investigation, undetermined. The CIA denied involvement entirely. The Chicago outfit said nothing, which was as good as a denial and as strong as a confirmation. The Los Angeles Times wrote that Roselli had died a mysterious death. The Washington Post called it an unsolvable riddle. The Chicago Tribune, more honest than the others, simply wrote, "He knew too much." But what did he know? That was the question that haunted people, not only in law enforcement, or in politics, or in organized crime, but in all three. Johnny had never threatened anyone. He never sent warnings. He never hinted at blackmail. He never recorded names, never kept files, never made demands. His power was never in documents. It was in memory. He was a vault, one that could never be hacked or subpoenaed. He didn't hold records. He held relationships. That was why he was dangerous. Because relationships don't disappear when you burn the files. When the Senate reopened hearings in the late 1970s, his name came up again. Not as a subject, not as a witness, not as a suspect, but as a reference, a sort of ghost marker. Anytime a senator touched on certain topics, CIA black operations, Castro assassination plots, mob influence in Las Vegas, covert financing, or Kennedy theories, one name hovered over conversation. Not Oswald, not Giancana, not Hoover. He became shorthand for something bigger. Whenever a question cut too close to truth, somebody cleared their throat and muttered, "Well, remember Roselli." And the room got quiet, even when no one remembered exactly what was said, even when no one could agree on facts, even when there was nothing to confirm. The fear wasn't in what he revealed. The fear was in what he confirmed. He confirmed that secrecy had limits, that loyalty had limits, that truth, like smoke, had a way of seeping through the smallest cracks. He did not expose the system. He exposed its possibility. Hollywood dramatized others. Luciano, Capone, Giancana, they became characters. Sinatra became legend. Hoffa became myth. But Johnny remained out of reach, not large enough to fictionalize, not clean enough to idolize, not infamous enough to package into a story. He existed instead on the edge of American storytelling, present but unrevealed. He became the closest thing America has ever had to a sanctioned phantom. He had once been a negotiator of silence, a silent diplomat between worlds that officially didn't know each other. The government knew he was not fully a criminal. The mob knew he was not fully a civilian. Washington knew he was not fully trustworthy. Chicago knew he was not fully expendable. He floated through these circles, belonging everywhere and nowhere. And that, ultimately, became his fate. Because a man who belongs everywhere will eventually not belong anywhere. After his death, some men tried to discredit him. They called him a minor figure, a glorified messenger, a storyteller. But that argument didn't stick. Because if he was so unimportant, why did so many powerful people want him to disappear? Why did multiple committees request his testimony? Why did both the mob and the government fear what he might say? Why was his name present in files that never mentioned him? Why did no one want to claim his body? The truth is, Johnny Roselli became a mirror. And when people looked at him, they didn't see him. They saw themselves. Senators saw what government might become when desperation replaces diplomacy. Mobsters saw what their world could become when money replaces discipline. CIA men saw what their missions might become when moral lines blur into practical ones. Vegas saw what it could become when corporations replace silence. Hollywood saw what it could become when stories replace truth. In the end, Johnny didn't write history. He revealed it. In his own way, in his restrained, elegant, almost reluctant fashion, he became a storyteller through absence. And that, perhaps, is why he still lingers. Not because he was the most famous. Not because he was the most powerful. Not because he killed or was killed. but because he was the only one who could walk into the room where history was being written and understand that none of the authors were honest. He is a reminder that beneath every official story, there is an unofficial version, a quieter version, a truer version, and that version is rarely written by historians. It is written by men like Johnny Roselli, the ones who don't appear in history's photographs, but appear in history's shadows. He was once asked, long before his death, what he thought his legacy would be. He smirked and adjusted his cufflinks. "Legacy," he said. "I don't leave legacies. I leave question marks." He kept that promise. In the end, maybe he was never meant to be understood. Maybe he was never meant to be solved. Maybe the man in the drum wasn't a mystery. Maybe he was an answer to a question this country never wanted to ask out loud. What happens when the unofficial history becomes more important than the official one? Roselli never wrote that answer. He lived it. And then, silently, he sank with it. But he didn't disappear. Because a man like that doesn't vanish when murdered. He vanishes when forgotten. And he was never forgotten. Not by Chicago. Not by Washington. Not by Hollywood. Not by those of us still curious enough to look behind the curtain. Not because we know what he did, but because, even now, we still wonder, what did he choose not to say? That, in the end, is his legacy. Not closure, not revelation, but enduring uncertainty. Johnny Roselli didn't just live in history. He became the part of history that cannot be proven, and therefore, cannot be erased. A ghost in American history. Still here. Still watching. Still quietly asking, what is truth? When no one wants the answer.